Hi, listeners. Today's episode features an amazing conversation with Dr. Rob Gore, and we're celebrating with a special book giveaway. You can win a copy of his book, Treating Violence: An Emergency Room Doctor Takes on a Deadly American Epidemic. For details, head over to LinkedIn or Instagram at Resa MD. Don't miss out, and good luck. Now let's get to the episode.
We were never intentionally trying to do a school program. We just wanted to get something up and running at the hospital and do an after-school program. But after a few weeks of doing stuff at the school, the students were like, "You guys are coming back, right?" And at that point, we started realizing, I said, we're making an impact, because we're just trying to have them participate in workshops and then have them transition to after-school activities, like an after-school community program. But we recognize it's like we're having an impact with these students that are here, and they're interested because they're asking us to come back. I said, we can't stop this. I was like, we're onto something, and this is going to become the basis of our school intervention. And it's like, wow, a novel concept. We're going to work with people before they become patients. You know more than anybody that it costs so much money to treat an emergency, but what if we just did something that was really, really proactive before the emergencies kick in? How could that be so transformative?
This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Robert Gore. Rob is an emergency medicine physician and the founder of KAVI, that's the Kings Against Violence Initiative. He works at Kings County Hospital Center in Brooklyn. He is a New Yorker, an inaugural TED resident, a CNN hero, and the author of Treating Violence: An Emergency Room Doctor Takes on a Deadly American Epidemic. Now, Rob has been on my guest list since I started the Visible Voices podcast, so I'm so delighted to be in conversation with him. Let's get to it. I wanted to start with your design of the book because I thought it was going to be mostly about KAVI, but the book is mostly about Rob and Rob becoming what KAVI is, KAVI becoming what Rob is. And again, I'd say it's maybe like 3/4, 1/4. And I was wondering about your decision to design the book in that way.
As educators, I think we're always writing something. You're always playing around with ideas. And there was a conference that you were probably in attendance to. It was the ACEP conference. It was in Boston. And this was probably 2008. And I remember there was a panel. They were talking about policy and decision making in emergency care. And Arthur Kellerman was on that panel. And he made a comment. And Art Kellerman is an amazing emergency physician. He was the chair of emergency medicine at Grady Hospital, and also one of the earlier figures in the public health space talking about gun violence and violence prevention and violence intervention. And he made a comment. He said, when you're trying to change policy and create these decisions, he said, people, they'll remember one statistic that you have. He said, but for the most part, he said, what they will remember are the stories. They'll remember the narratives. And that stuck with me back then. I always like storytelling, just from, listening to them and even telling my own. Maybe this is just a way to kind of express yourself. But when I started writing for the book, I was really writing for me. And it was a way for me to just kind of reflect on just my life and where I was. I was getting burned out with emergency medicine and just being around. I remember I started writing like actual chat. I took a course. Gotham Writers had like a memoir writing course. My dad said, that might be actually cool for you to check out. So I went there and I started writing these stories, and I realized, wow, I enjoy writing these stories. And it was really great to kind of reflect on past. Then shortly after that, I took a mini sabbatical. I was in Haiti and I was in Indonesia, and we were working on some of the global health projects that I had been doing already in Haiti, and then went to Indonesia just to kind of reflect and work on ideas that were tied to KAVI. And when you're alone, you have a lot of time to reflect. And I just started writing. All these different thoughts and feelings and emotions were coming out. And I just kept writing and reflecting on things that I thought were meaningful to me. And that was kind of the basis of the story. I started talking about Return of the Jedi and Star Wars and Yoda. I talked about stuff growing up in Brooklyn and places and people that I saw. And then, the more you reflect on those experiences, the more other things start to come up, the uncomfortable things. And there were themes that were tied to violence and trauma that were also coming up in the writings. And I was thinking back to my early origins and my first experiences with violence and trauma and how that related to what we were already doing with KAVI. And that stuff started getting put down on paper. And over time, it just kept growing and growing and growing. I knew I was going to write a book, but in doing so, I think writing itself became a very therapeutic process. And I enjoyed processing what I experienced. Shortly after that trip to Haiti and to Indonesia, my mentee, Willis Young, was killed. And Willis was stabbed multiple times on my birthday. As a matter of fact, in 2 days from now, will be the anniversary of his stabbing. And when he died, and even just with how we usually process emergencies, we often compartmentalize our emotions. And when, after his passing, there was a whole lot of compartmentalization, but I found with writing itself, it forced me to stop and to stay still and to be still and to think through everything that had taken place without those wounds kind of festering.
Mm-hmm.
And so that writing process became even more therapeutic. And then following, the year after, I did the TED residency. And the TED residency was an incubator for ideas. And it was really built around storytelling. And I began writing even more extensively, trying to figure out what was the best story to kind of convey to people who I was, but at the same time honoring what I had been experiencing. And that talk came up and more things. And the book itself started growing, and things that I didn't even know were going to be a part of it were being written down, and really just reflecting on every experience I had to try to connect dots. What happened in residency? What happened growing up? Why do I do these things? Why do I even think like this? Because I think we forget the origin stories, but when you have those moments of solitude and moments that where you're forced to reflect, these different things come up.
Thanks for that and taking us through that. And not only are you a storyteller and you've done things to inspire/curate the ability to be an effective storyteller, I believe all of us as physicians, and specifically, particularly emergency physicians, we are storytellers because we actually, in one shift may have anywhere from 10 to 40 stories shared to us.
Mm-hmm.
We have to listen. We have to translate that into an electronic health record. We used to handwrite, translate it. And then we often have to retell that person's story to a consultant, to the admitting team, or to the primary care doctor. And so we are interpreters of stories and recipients of stories all the time. So it only makes sense that actually storytelling is another one of our skills or tools in our toolbox. I want to go granular into the book, but first, a 30,000-foot question. How are you different having written this book?
I feel at peace in a sense because there's so many thoughts and feelings and emotions just been put out there. And through the telling of the story, it's forced me to have other conversations with other people like yourself who are going to ask very different aspects of the book, of the story. And I don't want to say I'm like reliving certain things. I think I've kind of moved beyond, trying to relive certain things. And I'm not dealing with any PTSD right now for many experiences. These are not that I'm aware of, but it's helping with kind of problem solving.
Yeah.
It's helping me embrace the reflective points on what we've done. I think it's also therapeutic to when people kind of have those aha moments when you're having a conversation with them. And it's like, oh, wow, what you just said and what you articulated in this discussion might have been a missing piece that I might have needed to help me through a special challenge that I'm navigating. And, I'm feeling kind of proud. You've written an incredible book. And just to realize, all the trials and tribulations and the editing and your editors bleeding on the paper and the drafts being thrown out, and really 3 to 4 times the amount of paper. Like, book is, anywhere between 150 to 200 something pages, but the amount of things that have been thrown away to be used for another time are probably 3 to 4 times that amount. And just to see how you can synthesize all these ideas together is like, wow, we did this and we had fun doing it and learned a lot in that process. But I really enjoyed the reflective nature of what life has been like post book or post writing the book. We move around so much and so quickly in the emergency department, and we tell stories over and over and over again. And we synthesize the information coming from those stories. But because of the adrenaline rush, because of the go, 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 because we're constantly in this fight or flight space, the reflective components of those stories that we convey aren't always there. And when they are there, they usually come up at times that we really don't want them to. It's like, I don't really need to reflect right now. I have some other work that I have to do. And we just get in the habit of putting those emotions aside, but not really being an active participant in the experience that we've just had. Educators, will tell you if you're working with a student, I'd ask my mother all the time, I was like, how did you help get these students to be in this space? And she said, you always have to have these willing participants. And I think with us processing our emotions, we also have to want to be willing participants in reflecting and really diving into the experiences that we've gone through. But having a conversation with complete strangers and people that know you and or don't know you or know you in one capacity and not another capacity, it forces us to explore different aspects of ourselves that we've kind of ignored.
That's right. And you really touched on something with which I resonate, that, we're emergency doctors. We're hearing all these stories. We're seeing some horrible things. We're seeing some joyful things. It's not all, doom and gloom. Some of it's amazing and funny, et cetera. And there's a compartmentalization, there's a sublimation, right? We're doing good for society. We're creating nonprofits. We're writing books. We're teaching. We're, all these things. And at some point, you need to process the feelings. And, I've had quite a few guests on the Visible Voices where we talk about trauma, the effects of trauma, what it does to us. A few years ago now, I had trauma surgeon Selwyn Rogers, emergency physician Everett Lynn come on, and particularly we were talking about trauma and what it's like to work in a place where you're constantly being exposed to trauma. What does that do to you? What do you do to take care of yourself? What does that do when you have children and you're worried about your children? Now, I want to start with geomapping a little bit. Born in Buffalo, raised in Brooklyn, you did a bunch of like high school / pre-college fun sounding summer experiences. One was at Prairie View A&M, and I shared with you the president of Prairie View, Ruth Simmons, had been the president at Brown University where I attended. So I felt like that was a nice little geo overlap. College in Atlanta, med school in Buffalo, residency in Chicago, now back in Brooklyn. And I know there were certainly global international segues as well, including places in Africa. You mentioned Haiti, Indonesia, etc. You and I are on the same page. Everywhere you go, people are people. Sick is sick. Everybody wants food, shelter, clothing, education. What is different is the way our society decides to treat people and decide whether people are heroes or they are victims. They are responsible for where they are and what they do versus they're not responsible. And I think what you have really focused on with KAVI is realizing that this is not and should not be and cannot be about blaming the victim. With KAVI, you did something that I just absolutely love in terms of design. You created a healthcare design, a human-centered design process where you recognize when someone comes into the emergency department, they have been shot. They are a victim of violence. That violence is in them. It stays with them. And it's not just about that one moment, that one photograph in time where we see them. That continues on to whatever happens to them from the emergency department. If they go upstairs to the intensive care unit, if they go home, if they pass, all their family members. And what you have designed and what your team does with KAVI is you have someone come into the emergency department and be with and sit with the family. Now, that's a rough sketch of what happens, but can you go deeper for the audience that aren't yet familiar with KAVI? What process is set up and in place for when people come to the emergency department having been victims of violence?
KAVI itself is a hospital, school, and community-based violence intervention program, really focusing on changing these conversations and providing support for people who've experienced trauma or really intentional trauma, or what we often refer to as violence. In our hospital program, we work with people who are patients and survivors of intentional trauma. Somebody comes in who's shot or stabbed, but there are a few things that take place. One, the emergency and the trauma team are really designed to keep people alive. You can't talk about intervention if the person is no longer here. So the goal, that golden hour of trauma is to really intervene and make sure that that person either goes to the operating room, you treat their physical injuries so they can at least be here for tomorrow. But then there's that second golden hour of trauma, and Carnell Cooper, who's an amazing trauma surgeon down in Maryland, who's also a founder of another violence intervention program. He spoke about something called the second golden hour of trauma, which is where if you intervene and provide those critical resources, you may be able to prevent retaliatory violence from occurring. And when I read that so many years ago, it's like, wow, that makes so much sense. If you can intervene where somebody's really at their greatest level of dysregulation after they've experienced a trauma, it can be healing. Fight or flight, having stress hormones that circulate through our body in an emergency are designed to keep us alive. However, our bodies can't really heal effectively when they're in this hyper-excitatory state for a long period of time. It can help provide protective factors, but if we're looking at long-term healing, that can't occur when you're in this excitatory kind of state. Having people around you who can help you, serve as an advocate and speak on your behalf, someone who's present, like our team members who are there and available to listen and to sit with you as long as you need after you've experienced a most horrendous event, are ways in which we can actually help calm our nervous systems. We don't often think about the physiology and the neurology regarding calming our nervous systems, but that's really what happens when somebody can speak to you in a way that's not threatening, when they can speak to you or really hear you in a way where you're not being judged. It can be very therapeutic. And when your body is in this calm space, maybe not completely calm because it takes a while for that to really occur, but when those hormone levels are coming down and the excitatory nature of what's taking place is decreasing, that relaxation can occur. And we, our bodies, are often more receptive to information and to healing when we're not in these excitatory states. So I feel like our team is a part of that process, that long-term healing, where we help get people past their initial injuries and moving to a space where they are able to be whole again and really get back into society in a way that is meaningful for them. Not meaningful for us, but meaningful for them. The sanctuary model is a model that was created a number of years ago by some people in Philadelphia. I forgot her name, but I know she was a part of John Rich's team and the team from Healing Hurt People. John Rich and Ted Corbin are two amazing physicians, one internal medicine, one emergency physician. They created a program called Healing Hurt People. And one of their team members created something called the sanctuary model, which has a number of different components, but it really kind of boils down to a specific acronym called SELF, which is safety, emotion, loss, and future. So after someone has experienced a trauma, how do you get them to a space where they're as optimized as they can possibly be, paying attention to their safety that may be in jeopardy after an initial injury, worrying about retaliatory violence, but providing those support services, paying attention to the emotions that occur after you've experienced a horrific event, the anxiety, the depression, the acute stress response, the acute stress disorder, the PTSD. That may be just a part of that person's experience. And that's including if they had pre-existing mental health issues. So how do you pay attention to that? How do you help the patient and their family address those mental health needs? And then the next thing, the L, helping them cope with loss. Whether it's a loss of function of a limb, loss of mobility, loss of a loved one, how do you help them cope? And then last but not least, looking at future. So I got to give, a shout out to the Healing Hurt People folks, the people who created the sanctuary model, because it helped give us a framework on how we can look at patients, not even just those who are survivors and victims of intentional trauma or violence, but patients as a whole who come to the emergency department. The trauma patients that we see aren't much different from the other patients that we see. Nobody comes to the ER because they just want to hang out, unless they want to see their friends because they just retired. And then they want to show off because they just came back from vacation and they're all relaxed and they're in this very peaceful state. That's the only time people want to come back. If they come to the emergency department, they're either scared that something bad is going to happen or something bad has happened, or they don't have another safety net. We're the place that's going to be stable enough to be able to take care of some of their individual needs, at least get them to as close as possible. When somebody comes in, whether they've had a heart attack, whether they've had a stroke, whether they've been a survivor of violence, whether they are having some sort of illness, they are terrified. And the people and patients and family members who have the best outcomes are those who have a high level of social support systems, who have all the best components of our social determinants of health, which impact our health and well-being. Access to economics, which can help support and create your help provide financial support for you to really be able to take care of your family, having adequate food, having healthy food, having an incredible social support system, having a most optimal healthcare system. These are all things that will make sure our patient outcomes are most optimal. When one of those things is removed, when a person doesn't have enough to eat, when they don't have a social support network, when they don't have money to pay for basic things like taking care of their family, when their home situation is continuously fluctuating, those patients don't do well. With KAVI, we want to help cultivate some of that stuff, at least get people some of those resources that allow that to take place.
Yeah, and I want to call out that KAVI is even more than what you shared. Like, you have meetings where kids come to spend time. And there was something that I pulled from the book that I really liked, that you talked about the internalizing of stress, what that looks like. And you talk about kids who come to the meetings, not because they're in a gang. They don't have a history of being violent. Perhaps they've, though, seen violence in the community, and they have developed anxiety that goes inside. Can you say a little bit about the support structures, the social aspects of KAVI?
So our school and community programs work with people who are considered to be at risk. We have in-school programming that has a full curriculum that goes over 32 weeks, focusing on mediation and conflict resolution and other life skill developments, other life skills that can be, that we want people to develop as they get older. But on the most basic level, it's both a safe space and it's also a brave space. And I use the word safety because if you don't feel safe, you can't really thrive. I use the word brave, and I just learned that term in terms of describing things as brave. But having a brave space allows you to have the courage to be able to discuss the things that you've been bothering them in a way that may be empowering for you. And so we have both a safe space and a brave space where when you're able to talk about the issues that have been bothering you, things that you may not always have the vocabulary for, being in a communal setting, being in a supportive setting can be very empowering because now you can describe the things that you've experienced. I think, our patients are absolutely brilliant on so many levels. They know their bodies better than anybody. Not everybody has the ability to convey what they've been experiencing to other people. And so, when we have these spaces, when we meet, some of the things that come up, or at least ways of conveying that I'm having a troublesome experience, and how do I communicate that to someone else? If you've experienced a trauma, if you're seeing a lot of trauma around you and it's overwhelming and you feel somewhat dysregulated, having heart palpitations, anxiety, you're in distress and you're just holding it all in and hiding it from other people because we're not taught to express this stuff. And the only way you know how to express something that's not happy is through anger. Having spaces that are both safe and brave may help us learn how to convey what we've been feeling and what we've been experiencing. Yeah. It's group therapy in a sense without calling it group therapy.
Right.
But if you call something therapy, not a lot of folks are going to go to it, physicians and surgeons included. But if you sit around and talk after work, you tend to have a session where you get all that stuff that's been inside of you out. And you feel like, wow, I'm glad I got together with my colleagues about it. But that was technically a therapy session without calling it a therapy session.
The audience completely understands why Resa invited Rob to come on the Visible Voices in terms of voice. And when I was reading the book, I said to myself, maybe 2011. Make sure you ask Rob about 2011. So I ask my guests, when did you realize you had a voice? When did you start using that voice? And in 2011, there was a meeting at your hospital, and it seemed like an aha breakthrough moment where you thought, I need to start talking about my work. I need to start making sure KAVI is pushed front and center because we're doing this and we're not getting the recognition, the props, the support for the work that we are doing here at home in our community.
Right. 2011 was an incredible year for me in terms of epiphanies and really being able to launch and start things. KAVI itself had existed as a concept on paper, and I was doing the work as an advocate with me and another attending physician, but that was pretty much it. We didn't have a program where we were working with actual people. We were trying to get it to that point, but we didn't have any money and we had very, very little support and just kept getting denied grants and people saying, wow, this is a great idea, but sorry, there's no money for it. Even approaching people in the hospital for years about this. And they say, wow, great idea, but sorry, there's no money. I had already been doing a lot of work in Haiti. We were training drivers and laborers in first aid and emergency response and built training programs that were really train the trainer models. And we did that stuff with very little to no money. And those programs were viable and they were continuing on and it was having an impact on these communities in the Northeast. We had also put together a policy conference on policy and decision making with, helping support local Haitian leadership in the northeastern part of Haiti and looking at how can we help transform this entire healthcare network and healthcare system that was existing to the point that it was viable and we can optimize patient care. We were part of that. And we were having these very key meetings and bringing people together and being a part of this amazing network of folks from northeastern Haiti. And coming back from Haiti and, to talk about violence prevention and to have somebody say, yeah, I'm sorry, there's no money. And I'm like, man, this really sucks. When our hospital corporation made the decision, said, oh, we're gonna support these other programs that are out there. And I'm like, we've been talking about doing this work and you all have been denying funding and resources to us. And I was like, nobody's going to care more about your stuff than you. And when I talked to my dad about some of this stuff, like I was furious. I'm like, I've been building programs in other places and the stuff is up and running. And I'd already built like pipeline programs at Kings County Hospital, at SUNY Downstate Medical Center. I lectured around the world and I'm like, how come this stuff isn't happening? And my dad was like, it's not happening because you're not doing anything. All you're doing is talking about the program and talking about the work and talking about the issues to other academics and other educators. If you want to do something, you got to really take this stuff to the people. Haiti was different because you brought this stuff to the people. You were working with people and there was a physical product that was being shown and it was working. It wasn't necessarily perfect, but the trainings existed. There was something that was tangible. And he said, nobody's going to invest in you unless you actually have something to offer, because people don't invest in theoretical programs. And we had this, this very kind of heartfelt, very uncomfortable conversation about starting things. And I had the idea, said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to start this program with no money. We're going to use it. We're going to do this as a volunteer basis. And we're not going to start it in the hospital because the hospital, there are too many sets of politics with dealing with the public hospital system in the city itself. But if we kind of scaled back and started with a very small cohort, what if we took it to a school that was across the street? What if we took it to them and worked with a small group of people? And it was going to work for a couple of reasons. I said, one, if they're students and at a school, that means they're not patients. And this may be very proactive at ensuring people don't become patients. But I said, who's going to turn away a free program? If we're going to be working with kids who consider to be at risk and kids that many people in schools don't want to deal with because they do have these sets of challenges. I said, what if we did that? And, I brought the proposal. I walked across the street from my office at Kings County. I went over to the high school across the street. A friend of mine was a guidance counselor there, and it happened to be her last day of work. So she was like, you need to come right now. And the principal is here, and there's some other people here that may be very helpful. And I said, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what we have. This is our curriculum. This is what we'd like to do. And these are who we want to work with. They said, great. They said, we can't pay you. I said, we don't need money. Mm-hmm. Just get us the people. And they were like, great, let's start. And we started at the end of September, early October of 2011. And that's how KAVI really became born. One part about that, we were never intentionally trying to do a school program. We just wanted to get something up and running at the hospital and do an after school program. But after a few weeks of doing stuff at the school, the students were like, you guys are coming back, right? Mm. And at that point, we started realizing, I said, we're making an impact, because we're just trying to have them participate in workshops and then have them transition to after school activities over at the hospital, almost like, like an after school community program. But, we recognize it's like we're having an impact with these students that are here, and they're interested because they're asking us to come back. I said, we can't stop this. I said, we're on to something, and this is going to become the basis of our school intervention. And really I was like, it was such a proactive thing. I was like, wow, a noble concept. We're going to work with people before they become patients. And it's not necessarily a sexy as a lot of the stuff that happens when we're dealing with emergencies. And you know more than anybody that it costs so much money to treat an emergency. But what if we just did something that was really, really proactive before the emergencies kick in? How could that be so transformative?
It's such a beautiful model of prevention, a healthcare system, not a sick care system. I feel the same way you do. People don't want to come to the emergency department. Most people don't want to hang out and be in the emergency department. I think it's particularly important to repeat aloud because we're very aware of this, but also we train people coming up through the healthcare process. And there's definitely these period of training where people are like, I can't believe they're here. Why are they here? They just want to hang out. I'm like, no, 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 no. Most people, like, unless sometimes there is mental illness, or sometimes there is seeking that safety net, scared, something truly is going on. And they're like, I need help. And so I think that's really worth emphasizing. I had opened the door a little bit to talking about what do you do when you're in these environments and you're constantly exposed to trauma? And that it's something that I've spoken with guests about throughout the time of this program. And I was particularly moved by one of the stories in the book. And it starts with everybody's good until they're not. And you share the story of a patient came in and was killed by intentional violence. And you sort of, quote, met his mother at that first instance. And then a time later, you met the mother again, the second instance, when a second son came to the emergency department. And for audience members that are a little nervous, this son did not die at that visit. However, the bridge broke, I'll say. The bridge broke during that second visit. And I'd like you to share a little bit about that and answer this question of what happens when the provider becomes the patient.
I was the provider and I also became the patient. The situation that you talk about took place the night of my mentee, Willis's funeral. Willis was killed. I mentioned earlier, Willis was stabbed multiple times on my birthday on July 22nd, 2015, and died a few weeks later in the surgical intensive care unit, which is where he would do violence intervention services. He was one of our KAVI team members. And, I never took any kind of breaks when one being the liaison between the family and the hospital, being a liaison with the hospital and the family and the community, being the liaison between the hospital and the people on our block, because Willis grew up on the block that I lived on. I never took any kind of break. And we had the funeral for him during the daytime, early afternoon, and I didn't sleep. I was still just up, going. I tried to sleep. I just couldn't because I had so many different thoughts. And the night of his funeral, I was working. Like, I didn't take any break, no time off. I went to work in the emergency department in our critical care and trauma area, which is the same place that he was brought after he was stabbed multiple times. And so I'm already anxious just about being there. And I'm thinking about, how do we honor Willis's life? I'm thinking about, will this happen again to somebody else that we know? And, the floodgates were just opening. But that night, there was a patient that I was going to be taking care of, that I wound up taking care of, who I met before. And I met him because his little brother, I pronounced dead a few years before. And here he was on a stretcher and he had been shot multiple times. He was serious condition, but he was still alive. And it's kind of like, wow, you don't realize how, I know because, I've been doing this for a while, but you try not to expect to take care of multiple family members with the same kind of injuries, particularly those due to violence. And particularly somebody who you pronounced dead. We know it happens all the time. And, neighborhood trauma, family trauma, and how this stuff kind of just circulates itself. But because all the risk factors are the same, from poor social support systems, violence in the community. And so it wasn't surprising that something like this happened, but it still kind of caught me off guard on a day that I was trying to process my own emotions. I was okay until I wasn't. When I saw the mother, and the mother recognized who I was, because I had given her bad news about her youngest son. And here I am treating her other child for being shot multiple times. She stopped making eye contact with me. She would ask questions, but she wouldn't even look at me. And I knew why, because I told her kid was killed before. And here we are having a very similar conversation a few years later. Then when I mentioned to her that her son that we were treating at the time was going to be admitted to the hospital for observation, she just, all of a sudden, she's like bursting in tears. And she looks at me and says, why does this stuff keep happening to my own family? Because she had lost one son, another son's on the stretcher. And then her nephew had been killed recently, which I didn't know at the time. Then she asked me, did my son say anything to you before he died? And this is a kid who came in who was still alive, but died in the ER, eyes open, still kind of mumbling, don't let me die and stuff like that. And it was just like, I couldn't say anything to her. And I was like, I felt guilty. I felt ashamed. I was upset that we couldn't keep our son alive. And I had just compartmentalized all the emotions tied to Willis and the family. And for some reason, when she asked those questions and I couldn't run, it was like I had to confront everything and all those emotions at the same time. And I got dry mouth. I started sweating and I ran into the bathroom because my heart was racing and I'm dry heaving and I'm having those like ugly cries where, if people who've had like toddlers and little kids, when they cry and they get to huffing, like I'm doing that. And I'm at work. I say that jokingly because, I see when like my kid has a meltdown or a tantrum and he's crying. I'm like, oh, wow. I understand what you feel, brother. But I'm having one of these and I'm at work and I still have about 6 or 7 hours left on my shift in the ER and I don't feel well. I'm tired. I'm dysregulated. I'm an emotional mess. My body is shaking. My hands are trembling. And I'm the person who's in charge. There are other patients that are in the ER that we've got to take care of and address. But now I'm the patient. I'm the person who's having panic attacks. I'm the person who probably needs to chill out and lay down into a quiet area so I can breathe. I might even need a Valium or some Versed just to calm down. But I couldn't because we're not taught to be the patient. We're taught to kind of hold it together as much as possible. And what I did was I just moved around because I figured if I sat still, then people could see me shaking. If I tried to type at the computer, they could see my hands were trembling. If I didn't keep moving, they could look at my eyes and see that my eyes were red and then I was tearful. But if I kept it moving and just avoided eye contact and avoided long-term physical contact, they wouldn't know that anything was wrong. If they didn't notice anything was wrong, then I could really be okay. But those situations kept happening more and more over the course of the week. The dry heaves, the heart palpitations, the sweating, and I was having panic attacks. And it's weird for you to have a panic attack if you've never had these things before. We've all experienced some sort of anxiety. It's a natural emotion, but I'm not supposed to be the physician in charge. I'm not supposed to be the attending, and I'm having panic attacks for stuff that that I take care of on a regular basis. But it's always different when you're connected to the situation at hand. It's different when you've experienced loss. When it's somebody else's loss, you go, okay, you can kind of move on. But now this is a very personal thing, and I couldn't run from that. So I started going back to therapy, really to one, I was like, I can't not function. I was like, my livelihood is dependent on this, the livelihood of other patients. We make split-second decisions on an ongoing basis. And if we're not focused, if we're not super alert, if we can't connect these dots and these patterns, people die. And so we can't even afford to be off. We can't afford to have an off day. The emergency staff, the emergency physician, the emergency worker cannot have an off day because that means everybody else has an off day and that means loss of life or loss of function. But I started going.
I ask about this story not to re-traumatize, not, for anything except that, number one, I felt that story very much. Everything you just shared about, needing to think clearly, needing to function, needing to be on. It's how we're socialized. It's what we're supposed to do. And we're not shown the model of that regulating the nervous system. And you do a lot to regulate your nervous system. I also subscribe to practices to help regulate the nervous system. And it's the only way to keep ourselves healthy. And that story, not only is it illustrative of your work in Brooklyn, but it's also, this is my story. I am human. And all of a sudden it came to a head. And yeah, thank you for sharing the story.
Yeah, thank you. But, like regulating our nervous systems, I think you have to kind of embody that. All the physicians and surgeons that we used to admire growing up and still do admire, when they came in the ER, they just seemed calm. It didn't mean that they weren't nervous, but they were able to regulate and control to a point that they were highly functional and highly effective. And it's like, man, I was like, how do you get to that space? How do you get to that point? And I don't know if they were doing their own internal breathing, if it was just their personality, or if this was something that this just practice. But we've got to figure out ways to kind of promote vagal stimulation to allow those smooth muscles to really kind of kick in, and for us to put a halt on the gas pedal that's causing us to be so hyper and so anxious.
Yeah.
You asked me before, like, what was it like when I first started writing the book? Probably the first chapter I wrote was, but it didn't make the final cut, but I was writing about Yoda. I learned about meditation and trying to learn how to be calm because I watched Star Wars and I watched a lot of Kung Fu movies. And, they used to come on Channel 5. And I always liked how people were able to kind of learn how to channel this power, this chi. And Yoda and the Jedis were trying to use the Force. And I was like, oh, if they can use it. I was like, this is what I want to do because I want to learn how to move and levitate rocks. And in order to do that, I got to be still. And so I started practicing a lot of breathing back then without even really knowing what I was doing. It might only been like 15 seconds or 20 seconds per se, but it was a way of kind of calming down. And my mother didn't care if I did that because she was like, wow, that's 15 seconds, 30 seconds that he's not causing chaos in the apartment. And, over time, and I didn't even talk about this in the book. I really thought about this the other day when we were doing another talk. After I got jumped and I started going to martial arts, we started learning how to breathe. And we started learning how to breathe with lowering the diaphragm and pushing out the belly so you can take maximum amount of inhalation. So you had more oxygen to be able to function and execute movements with a level of power and precision. And I continued doing that stuff. I still breathe like that. I used to sit still and lay down on the bed practicing, having my hand on my belly, forcing myself just to breathe in and hold it for a period of time and breathe and then breathe out, moving from doing that in a very conscious state because I'm trying to retrain my body to breathe and to calm down to a point that it just became natural and just what I did. But I didn't think about that until pretty recently. But I think a lot of this stuff kind of comes back to the breath. What can you do to regulate your breathing in a way that calming state takes place? What are the physical activities that we can do to kind of help dissipate a lot of the stress hormones? How do we minimize the internal triggers from what we take in as a part of our diet that minimizes a lot of the excitation, the caffeine and other stimulants that are very prevalent amongst our colleagues, but you can't really heal your body if you're in this excitatory state all the time. So I started really paying attention to a whole lot of what does wellness look like, both as a healthcare provider, not so that we don't have to become patients, but so that we can actually be of greater service to others.
Love it. Safe spaces, brave spaces, wellness spaces, deep breathing spaces. Rob, for the audience members that want to support you, the work of KAVI, how can they get in touch with you and follow along in your journey?
We have an incredible team, and they can get in touch with me and our incredible leadership at kavibrooklyn.org. That's KAVIBROOKLYN.org. They can check us out on social media, LinkedIn, and see the different programs that we're doing. They can support financially. There's so many in-kind support options that we would also welcome. And there may be some synergy in creating partnerships with other people who share a very similar vision and maybe in different parts of the country and different parts of the world who have an interest in helping promote and cultivate wellness in spaces that may be experiencing great deals of trauma. So they can check us out, kavibrooklyn.org. They can reach out and we're welcome to see what's next.
The Resa wrap-up. Special thanks to Dr. Rob Gore for joining me in conversation. I really, really, really am so appreciative that he joined me. So 3 take-home points, audience. Number 1, trauma is not just one thing. Trauma can be physical, emotional, psychological, social, and so many different Venn diagram aspects that is trauma. So in other words, the treatment for trauma must be comprehensive. Number 2, I want you to think about community-centered healing. This means involving communities in their own care, and that is essential for breaking cycles of violence. In other words, we're talking about healthcare design, human-centered design, having the end user be at the center of the conversation for solutions. And number 3, a focus on prevention. By empowering at-promise youth with education and mentorship, we can help prevent and break a cycle of violence. That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices in the healthcare, equity, and current trends spaces. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa E. Lewis. Please find me through my website and on social media, Resa E. Lewis MD, or through the podcast, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, please be sure to share the show with a friend. The views and opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the institution with which they are affiliated or identified. Information herein should never be used as a substitute for clinical judgment or for medical advice.